The evening sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as the judge gathered his belongings after another demanding day in court. His black judicial robe, now carefully hung in his office, had been replaced by a perfectly pressed navy blue suit. The weight of the day's cases still lingered in his mind, especially the civil rights hearing that had stretched on for hours. The parking lot was nearly empty when he walked to his car, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete. His dark gray BMW, though 10 years old, still turned heads. He'd worked hard for it, climbing his way up from a public defender to become one of the state's most respected judges. 15 years on the bench had earned him a reputation for fairness and insight that crossed all community lines. As he settled into the leather driver's seat, he couldn't help but smile thinking about getting home to his family. His daughter had texted earlier about making his favorite dish for dinner, her way of celebrating his 15th year as a judge. The thought of home-cooked food made him realize just how hungry he was, having skipped lunch to finish reviewing case files. The drive home started like any other. He took his usual route through the city's west side, where elegant Victorian homes lined the streets. The landscaped medians and carefully maintained gardens reflected the neighborhood's affluence, a place he proudly called home for the past decade. The car's climate control hummed softly as he listened to the evening news, his mind already shifting from courtroom concerns to family time. At a red light, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball in a driveway, reminding him of his own childhood dreams of becoming a lawyer. Their laughter carried through his slightly opened window, bringing a warm smile to his face. This was why he loved his neighborhood. It felt alive, full of families and future dreams. The sun had nearly set when he first noticed the police cruiser in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first. Police patrols were common in this upscale area. But something felt different this time. The cruiser stayed unusually close, following his every turn. His judicial instincts, honed by years of observing human behavior in his courtroom, began to tingle. He double-checked his speed, exactly at the limit, his tail lights. All working, he just had them checked last week. Registration? Current and properly displayed. Insurance? Up to date. He ran through the mental checklist that had become second nature over years of being a black man driving in America, regardless of his position. The police car continued to follow, close enough now that he could make out the officer's silhouette in his mirror. His hands instinctively adjusted to the textbook position on the steering wheel, 10 and 2. Years of legal experience had taught him that even the smallest details mattered in situations like this. The familiar streets of his neighborhood now felt different, each turn carrying a weight he hadn't felt in years. The beautiful homes and manicured lawns that usually brought him comfort now seemed like mere backdrop to this unwelcome dance of follow the leader. His dinner plans, the warm welcome waiting at home, his daughter's cooking, all of it suddenly felt very far away. Little did he know, this routine drive home was about to become anything but routine. The next few minutes would test not just his patience and dignity, but would spark a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of local law enforcement and community relations. The flash of red and blue lights shattered the peaceful evening. The police cruiser's siren chirped twice, that distinctive sound that makes every driver's heart skip a beat. The judge took a deep breath, his fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel as he carefully signaled and pulled over to the right side of the tree-lined street. Years of preserving over traffic cases had taught him exactly what to do. He positioned his car well off the road, turned off the engine, and placed his hands where they would be clearly visible. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, noting how the policeman's hand rested near his holster, a detail that didn't escape his trained eye. The officer was young, probably in his early 30s, with a rigid posture that spoke more of aggression than professional caution. His flashlight beam swept through the car's interior before settling uncomfortably on the judge's face. The bright light was unnecessary in the still bright evening, and its deliberate aim felt more like an intimidation tactic than standard procedure. License and registration, the officer demanded, skipping any formal greeting. His tone carried that edge of authority that the judge had heard countless times in his courtroom, usually from witnesses trying too hard to establish dominance. The judge noticed the officer's nameplate read Officer R. Wilson, though the man made no effort to introduce himself. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" The judge inquired politely, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in court. He maintained eye contact through the side mirror, noting how the officer's stance shifted, subtle signs of discomfort at being questioned, even respectfully. "Suspicious behavior," came the curt reply. "You made several turns back there like you were trying to lose me." The accusation hung in the air, as baseless as it was revealing. The judge had simply been driving his usual route home, the same path he'd taken for the past decade. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, the judge reached for his wallet. "Officer, I want to respectfully inform you that I'm a superior court judge. My credentials are right here with my license." He started to pull out his judicial ID, but the officer's reaction was immediate and alarming. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The officer's voice rose sharply, his hand now fully on his weapon. "I don't care who you claim to be. Step out of the vehicle now." The situation was escalating rapidly, taking on that all-too-familiar pattern the judge had seen countless times in cases before his bench. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he reviewed bodycam footage showing similar scenes? How many times had he listened to testimony about suspicious behavior that amounted to nothing more than driving while black? As he carefully opened his door, the judge maintained his professional composure, though his mind raced through the potential consequences of this encounter. His daughter was probably setting the dinner table right now, wondering why he was late. His wife would start worrying soon if he didn't call. The whole scene felt surreal. Here he was, a respected judge with 15 years on the bench, being treated like a criminal less than a mile from his own home. The evening air had cooled considerably, but that wasn't why a chill ran down his spine. Other cars passed by slowly, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene. He recognized some as his neighbors, and the humiliation of the moment burned deep. Yet he kept his voice steady, his movements measured, his demeanor professional, skills honed through years of maintaining order in his own courtroom. "Officer," he tried again, "if you will just allow me to show you my credentials." "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," the officer interrupted, his voice carrying that dangerous mix of fear and authority that the judge knew could make situations like this go terribly wrong. The judge complied, feeling the cool metal of his car against his palms, the same car he'd driven proudly off the lot after making partner at his law firm years ago, before ascending to the bench. As he stood there, the distant sound of his phone ringing inside the car, probably his worried family, the judge reflected on how quickly dignity could be stripped away. Even with all his achievements, all his years serving the justice system, here he stood, hands on his car, being treated like a threat instead of the public servant he was. The clouds had taken on a deep purple hue, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Whatever happened next would change more than just this evening. It would become a testament to either the persistence of systemic bias or the possibility of meaningful change. Or perhaps somehow both. The street lamps flickered to life one by one, casting long shadows across the scene. The judge stood perfectly still, his expensive suit collecting moisture from the evening air as he kept his hands planted firmly on his car. Behind him, Officer Wilson was running his license plate, but something wasn't right. The officer seemed to be deliberately taking his time, almost as if he was waiting for something. "My judicial credentials are in my wallet," the judge said again, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "If you just take a moment to—" "Sir, I've heard every story in the book," Officer Wilson cut him off sharply. "Everyone's somebody important, aren't they?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick, dismissive. Through the car window, the judge could see his phone lighting up again. His family must be really worried by now. A couple walked their dog on the opposite sidewalk, slowing down to stare at the scene. The judge recognized them from neighborhood association meetings, but they quickly looked away when he caught their eye. The shame of the moment burned deep, but he maintained his dignified composure, drawing on years of courtroom experience to keep his emotions in check. "Officer," he tried once more, his tone professional but firm, "I understand you're doing your job, but you're making a serious mistake. I am a sitting judge in this district and—" "Step away from the vehicle." Officer Wilson's voice suddenly rose several notches. "You just don't know when to be quiet, do you?" The officer's hand was back on his weapon, his entire demeanor shifting from dismissive to aggressive in an instant. The judge's heart raced, but his external calm never wavered. He'd seen this pattern too many times in his courtroom, routine situations spiraling out of control because of preconceptions and prejudice. As a judge, he'd reviewed countless cases where simple traffic stops escalated into something much more serious. Now he was living it. "I'm going to reach for my credentials very slowly," the judge announced clearly, making sure his voice would be picked up by the officer's body camera. He knew the importance of creating a clear record. How many times had such footage been crucial evidence in his own courtroom? "Don't move," Officer Wilson barked, stepping closer. "You're being uncooperative and suspicious. Put your hands behind your back." The metallic click of handcuffs being drawn sent a chill through the evening air. More cars were slowing down now, creating a small traffic jam on the usually quiet street. The judge could hear whispers and see phones being raised to record the scene. In the growing darkness, the police cruiser's flashing lights painted everything in alternating red and blue, creating an almost surreal atmosphere in this peaceful suburban setting. The judge's mind raced through his options. As a legal professional, he knew his rights intimately. As a black man in America, he knew the reality of this situation just as well. As a judge, he had sworn to uphold the law and maintain its dignity. All these identities collided in this moment, demanding different responses. "Officer Wilson," he said, using the name he'd read earlier, trying to establish a human connection, "I want to cooperate fully, but you need to understand who you're dealing with. There are proper procedures." The cold steel of the handcuffs against his wrists cut off his words. The sensation was shocking. In 15 years of serving on the bench, he'd ordered countless people into custody, but never imagined he'd feel the bite of handcuffs himself, especially not in his own neighborhood, less than a mile from the courthouse where he worked. Through his car window, he could see his briefcase on the passenger seat, containing the day's cases he planned to review after dinner. His phone was still lighting up periodically with calls and messages. The normal evening he'd anticipated had transformed into something that would likely become tomorrow's headlines. A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining a cautious distance but watching intently. Some had their phones out, recording everything. The judge noticed one of his colleagues from the courthouse among them, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. This was no longer just a personal humiliation, it was becoming a public spectacle that would have far-reaching consequences. As Officer Wilson roughly guided him toward the patrol car, the judge maintained his dignity. He kept his head high, his demeanor composed, even as his mind raced through the implications of what was unfolding. This moment, as painful as it was, could become a catalyst for change. But first, he had to ensure his own safety in an increasingly volatile situation. The back seat of the police cruiser felt cold and foreign, a space the judge had only ever imagined from witness testimonies in his courtroom. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable, designed for submission rather than comfort. Through the partition, he could hear Officer Wilson radioing for backup, describing him as an uncooperative suspect. Words that would have seemed almost laughable if the situation weren't so serious. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, but he remained perfectly still, knowing every movement would be scrutinized. The crowd outside had grown larger, their phones glowing like fireflies in the deepening dusk. He recognized several faces, neighbors, fellow church members, even parents from his daughter's school. The mix of shock, concern, and embarrassment on their faces mirrored his own internal struggle. Inside the cruiser, the radio crackled with dispatcher responses and codes. The judge listened carefully, his years of legal experience allowing him to understand the subtext of these communications. Officer Wilson was building a narrative, one that painted him as confrontational and difficult despite his consistent cooperation. "Be advised, suspect claims to be a judge," Wilson's voice carried through the car's open window. The word claims hung in the air like an insult, dismissing 15 years of dedicated service to the justice system. The judge closed his eyes briefly, thinking of the irony. Just hours ago, he had been presiding over cases involving police conduct, and now here he was, experiencing firsthand what so many had testified about in his courtroom. The flashing lights continued their rhythmic dance, painting the surrounding houses in alternating red and blue. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some were filming, others whispering among themselves, and a few brave souls were approaching Officer Wilson, apparently trying to vouch for the judge's identity. Through the police car's window, he could see his own car, still sitting there with its door open, interior light spilling out into the evening. His phone had finally stopped ringing. His family had probably shifted from worried to panicked by now. His dinner would be cold, but that seemed like the least of his concerns at this point. A light drizzle began to fall, creating halos around the street lamps and sending the spectators scurrying for cover, though most remained, umbrellas popping open like mushrooms in the gathering darkness. The judge watched as Officer Wilson paced near his patrol car, his body language betraying growing uncertainty. Perhaps reality was finally beginning to seep through the officer's preconceptions. Inside the cruiser, the judge focused on his breathing, keeping it steady and calm. He thought about all the times he'd advised young law students about maintaining composure under pressure. Now he was living those lessons in the most personal way possible. His suit, which had started the day crisp and professional, was now wrinkled and damp from the cramped backseat. The radio crackled again. Backup was 2 minutes out. The judge knew these next few moments would be crucial. Either the situation would escalate further, or reason would finally prevail. He watched Officer Wilson through the rain-streaked window, noting how the young officer's confident demeanor had begun to crack slightly as more residents approached him, likely trying to explain who he had just arrested. Time seemed to slow down in the confined space of the police car. The judge could hear his own heartbeat above the patter of rain and the murmur of the growing crowd. He thought about his courtroom, where he'd spent countless hours ensuring justice was served fairly and impartially. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. How many times had he reviewed cases involving unlawful arrests, never imagining he'd experience one himself? Through the windshield, he saw more police lights approaching in the distance. The backup Officer Wilson had called for was arriving. What happened next would depend largely on who stepped out of those approaching vehicles. Would they be officers who knew him from the courthouse? Would they be able to resolve this situation before it escalated further? Or would they simply fall in line with Officer Wilson's misguided assumptions? As the new police cars pulled up, their headlights cutting through the light rain, the judge straightened his posture as much as the handcuffs would allow. Despite the humiliation of his situation, he was determined to maintain the dignity of his position. This incident, he realized, was no longer just about him. It would become a testament to the work still needed in the justice system he had served for so long. By sunrise the next morning, the story had exploded across local news channels. Cell phone videos from the previous night filled social media, showing the respected judge standing dignified in handcuffs while neighbors protested his treatment. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters when the judge arrived for work, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every moment. Inside his chambers, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Colleagues, community leaders, and civil rights organizations all wanted to speak with him. His email inbox was flooding with messages of support and outrage. Even the governor's office had reached out, expressing deep concern about the incident. But amid all the chaos, the judge maintained his usual calm demeanor, reviewing his cases for the day just as he had done for the past 15 years. The police chief personally visited his chambers that morning, the lines of worry evident on his face. "This is a nightmare," the chief admitted, settling into the chair across from the judge's desk. "Officer Wilson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The chief's hands fidgeted with his hat, his discomfort obvious. "We're prepared for whatever action you want to take." The judge looked out his window at the media circus below. Protest signs were already appearing among the crowd, their messages demanding justice and change. He thought about Officer Wilson, about the fear and prejudice that had driven his actions. The easy path would be to demand the officer's termination, to file lawsuits, to feed the growing outrage. But 15 years on the bench had taught him that real change rarely came from punishment alone. "Chief," he said, turning back to face the nervous police leader, "I think we have an opportunity here." The words came slowly, thoughtfully. "Instead of just punishing one officer, we could address the root of the problem." The chief leaned forward, relief mixing with curiosity on his face. Throughout the day, the judge continued his court schedule as usual, though he couldn't help but notice how the incident had affected his courtroom. Officers who came to testify seemed more subdued, more respectful. Some could barely meet his eyes, perhaps imagining themselves in Officer Wilson's position. Even the defendants appeared different, seeing him in a new light after the viral videos of his ordeal. During the lunch break, his daughter called, still upset about the previous night's events. "Dad, you have to do something," she insisted. "You can't let them get away with this." He could hear the pain and anger in her voice, understanding how deeply the incident had affected his family. His wife had barely slept, and his son had wanted to fly home immediately from college after seeing the news. "Trust me," he assured her, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm going to handle this the right way," and he meant it. Already, ideas were forming in his mind, not just about punishment, but about real, lasting change. By late afternoon, community leaders began arriving at his chambers for informal discussions. The president of the local NAACP, the police union representative, community activists, and senior officers all came together. The judge listened more than he spoke, hearing the pain, frustration, and hope in their voices. Each person brought a different perspective, but they all agreed on one thing. This incident needed to become a turning point. As evening approached, the judge received word that Officer Wilson had requested to speak with him. The young officer had spent the day facing his own storm, media camping outside his house, death threats on social media, his personal information being spread online. The judge thought carefully about this request, understanding its significance. The courthouse was nearly empty when Officer Wilson was escorted in by Officer Chen. The young officer looked different now, humbled, scared, but also genuinely remorseful. His hands shook slightly as he sat down, unable to meet the judge's eyes at first. The same man who had been so aggressive just 24 hours ago now seemed almost childlike in his vulnerability. Looking at Wilson, the judge saw beyond the uniform to the person wearing it. He saw someone shaped by prejudices they might not even recognize, someone who needed guidance more than punishment. The media would want blood, the protesters would demand firing, but the judge saw an opportunity for something more meaningful. As the sun set outside his chamber's window, casting long shadows across the room, the judge began to outline his vision for change. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't revenge, it's reform. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the judge stood at a podium in the police academy's main hall. The room was packed with officers, community leaders, and media representatives. Rather than filing lawsuits or demanding terminations, he had spent these months working with the police department to create real, lasting change. "Today marks the beginning of something new," he announced to the crowded room. His voice carried the same authority it held in his courtroom, but with an added touch of hope. The new police training program he helped develop was about to launch, focusing on community relations and bias recognition. But what made this program different was its personal touch. He would be directly involved in teaching it. In the front row sat Officer Wilson, no longer in uniform but still part of the force. His face showed the journey he'd been through, the shame, the learning, and finally the understanding. Instead of losing his job, he had become an unexpected ally in reform. His story, and his willingness to speak honestly about his mistakes, had become a powerful teaching tool. "Change doesn't come from punishment alone," the judge continued, scanning the faces in the crowd. "It comes from understanding, from walking in each other's shoes." He could see heads nodding, especially among the veteran officers who had initially resisted these changes. The incident had opened eyes throughout the department, showing how even a respected judge could fall victim to prejudice. The new training program wasn't just about watching videos or listening to lectures. Officers would spend time in the communities they served, not just patrolling, but actually getting to know the people. They would sit in courtrooms, watching justice at work from a different perspective. And most importantly, they would hear stories, real stories from real people about how police interactions had affected their lives. Behind the podium, a large screen showed statistics from the first pilot program. Complaints against officers had dropped significantly in participating precincts. Community trust scores had risen. But the most telling change wasn't in the numbers, it was in the faces of the officers themselves, many of whom now spoke openly about their own biases and their commitment to overcoming them. Officer Wilson had become an unexpected symbol of this transformation. His story, from making a terrible mistake to becoming an advocate for change, resonated with both officers and community members. He now spent time talking to new recruits about that night, about the assumptions that had clouded his judgment, and about the lessons he'd learned. The judge's family sat in the audience, pride evident on their faces. His daughter, who had initially demanded harsh punishment for Officer Wilson, had come to see the wisdom in her father's approach. She had even helped develop part of the community engagement program, turning her anger into positive action. Local businesses had joined the initiative, offering their spaces for community police meetings. Churches opened their doors for dialogue sessions. Schools invited officers to speak with students, not just about law enforcement, but about life, dreams, and understanding. The ripple effects of that one traffic stop had spread far beyond anyone's expectations. This isn't just about police training, the judge explained, his voice filled with conviction. This is about building bridges, about seeing each other as human beings first. He gestured to the diverse group gathered in the room, officers, community leaders, activists, and citizens, all working together toward a common goal. The media coverage had shifted too. Instead of focusing on the controversy, they now reported on the positive changes taking place. Other police departments had begun reaching out, wanting to learn more about the program. What had started as a potential tragedy was becoming a model for reform. As the judge concluded his speech, he saw Officer Chen in the audience, now one of the program's most enthusiastic supporters. Chen had taken the initiative to start a mentoring program, pairing veteran officers with new recruits to discuss not just procedures, but ethics, empathy, and community relations. The applause that filled the room wasn't just polite, it was genuine, hopeful. People were standing, some with tears in their eyes, others nodding in appreciation. This wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a significant milestone. That night of humiliation and anger had been transformed into something powerful and positive. Outside the academy, the sun was setting on the city, casting a warm glow over the streets where that fateful traffic stop had occurred. Those same streets now saw officers and citizens greeting each other by name, sharing stories, building trust. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but change was happening, one conversation, one person, one moment at a time.